don't keep up that pace, we're projecting will more likely be about 20. And if lean economic times hit the Department of Defense, or there aren't sufficient incentives in the market, because much of this isn't defense investments, but it's commercial investments that are on defense lands or the purchase of renewable energy credits, this could also be the scenario. So this idea was looking at, well, how do we evaluate where we're at and what the investment needs to be to make that goal of 2025.
Question?
Yeah.
The penetration of renewables into the grid is limited due to their intermittency and the lack of electrical storage systems.
Yes.
So when you, for wind, for example, if you run the statistics, at about 10% of the grid capacity, things get truly difficult. Now, when you go to 20%, is this to say that on military installation, you have a higher tolerance for intermittent power, or is it saying you're going to be exchanging electricity with the grid, but your 20% total is still a smaller total ratio to the whole grid? See my point?
I do.
In other words, you can't pull that off and be self-contained terribly easily.
No, it is not necessarily a plan that's going to be all self-contained. There is some of this which would be, we didn't break that out that way, but that would be a useful way to break it out. Some of this which would be anticipated to be local and supported by microgrids on basis. But I've mentioned a couple of times, a lot of it's going to come from purchases off of utility providers, renewable energy credits. So it's a mix. And whether or not it's even feasible to get there is another question. This question was, are we on a path from an investment point of view to get there? And probably not. I mean, the only way we've gotten close in terms of progress is funding that isn't likely to come again, the stimulus funding. Okay, globally, what's the picture from the Army's point of view? Here, there is a very strong resonance between the Army's sustainability plans and the senior Army leaders that there is a problem with how we project force. And that problem has a lot to do with the vulnerability of this sorts of situations where we're driving out loads of water and loads of fuel and have very vulnerable supply lines. And if we can reduce the requirements to supply our forward operations, 10%, 20%, whatever percent, we are also reducing our vulnerabilities. We also have done some studies on the fully burdened cost of water and fuel in theater, which, when you take into account security, are really jumping those costs up. And actually water and fuel are about even when you look at, because it isn't so much the raw material cost, it's the logistics cost and the security cost. And getting to those remote locations in Afghanistan, we could be up to $50 a gallon. The larger base camps, the easier access ones in Iraq and Afghanistan, were maybe 25, 30 a gallon. But we're talking a lot of cost, as well as, and the bigger issue is not really cost for the Army, it's vulnerability, it's loss of life of soldiers and civilians. Because these supply lines are the most vulnerable part of the mission right now. That's where you put the IEDs, or you try to attack the supply lines. So a key issue. And it's an issue where there's been lots of acknowledgement. This was one of our heroes was this General Zilmer, who first raised this issue at the high level, saying there was a crucial need for self-sustainable energy solutions and reducing dependence on fuel for power generation. This is a report we did in 2008 that looked at, well, how can we improve this? What are the gaps in our technical know-how? And on front here is a microgrid that might be employed at a forward-facing facility. There's a lot of efforts now. There's actually 34 separate microgrid projects in the Army right now. So we're definitely moving out on technologies that will address these issues. Another global issue from the Army's perspective is how do climate change and climate security come into our mission these days. The 2008 Defense Authorization Act required the Department of Defense to address this and required them to address it within this 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, which looks sort of strategically at the challenges of the Defense Department and the nation from a defense perspective every 4 years. And these are a couple of statements about climate change, energy security, and economic security are inextricably linked and critical to our future for the Department of Defense is understanding these and working with others to mitigate the impacts. Locally, a couple of the things we've done is focus on issues in Alaska. I say locally, we got this effort underway, partnered with the University of Alaska and Alaska District and a couple of the research programs in the Department of Defense. And in 2009, we had a workshop in Anchorage looking at what are the vulnerabilities that we have across the Department of Defense in Alaska. Since then, the U.S. Navy Task Force Climate Change has gotten very, very active with issues in the Arctic and Alaska. And there's been a number of research projects initiated looking at the fact that permafrost, not staying frozen, is reducing the ability of the Army to train in Alaska because the Army depends on frozen ground days. And when we don't have as many frozen ground days, the training is interrupted and the whole hydrologic system in those training lands is disrupted and we have limited access to training. So we're trying to understand what the dynamic is, how we can address it, and how we can adjust training activities. I also wanted to point out there's a lot of thinking. I see in some of your forums you're going to be touching on some of these issues later about how we conduct operations and what should we be doing in forward operations that